Chapter 4. The road to San Sebastian was a fast autopista, and Madrid's international airport was soon behind him as he headed north towards the País Vasco, under a luminous sky. 3.5 hours later, the road descended from the dry plateau to the greenery of the Atlantic coast. Skirting Bilbao, he continued north to San Sebastian, and less than half an hour later he pulled up outside the Hotel de Londres, a fine 19th century edifice that overlooked La Concha, the magnificent beach and bay that was the splendour of Donostia, as the Basques called their city. The Hotel de Londres y de Inglaterra was a landmark that dated to the latter half of the 19th century, when the railways opened up the Basque country to tourism after the Spanish king Alfonso XII chose the city as his summer residence and set up court. His queen, Maria Cristina of Austria, then built the Palacio de Miramar overlooking La Concha. The arrival of the court soon attracted Europe's nobility and upper classes, and a new form of elite tourism developed as in Biarritz, which lay 40 kilometers to the north, where the French Emperor Napoleon III built a palace for his Spanish wife Eugénie de Montijo. The city became a pole of attraction during the Belle Epoque, making San Sebastian one of the most cosmopolitan cities in Europe. Visited by Queen Victoria in 1889 during her sojourn in Biarritz. Other visitors included the Prince of Wales, artists like Toulouse-Lautrec, and actors such as Orson Welles. San Sebastian continued to prosper during World War I, whilst the rest of Europe fought in the trenches. One of the victims of that terrible conflict was a well-known visitor to the city, Margarita Gertrude Zeller, also known as Mata Hari, who was executed in Paris in 1917 by a firing squad for allegedly spying for the Central Powers. Less spoken about today was Generalissimo Franco, El Caudillo, who until his death in 1975 had his summer home in the city. After checking in, Simo called Scott Fitznorman, who invited him over to the Kursaal Congress Centre, which he explained was a short taxi ride or a 15-minute walk away. Simo opted for the walk. It would clear his head after almost a full day of travelling. With a city plan in his hand to guide him, he left the hotel on the seafront side. The temperature was in the mid-20s, mild and refreshing, compared to the sticky Caribbean climate he was more used to. It was relatively calm for early summer. The tourists were not in a hurry to venture too far with the COVID-19 pandemic hanging over them, as the virus almost certainly had not said its last word. Sporting his Toquilla straw Panama and a brightly coloured short-sleeved shirt, he set off. It wasn't Simo's first visit to Spain, though he had never visited the País Vasco. He enjoyed his stroll, admiring the fine 19th century architecture of the city, though he firmly held his briefcase under his arm. Having lived in the Caribbean most of his life, he was taking no chances, even if the Basque country was considered a very law-abiding region of Spain. He couldn't miss the Kursaal, a modern glass and concrete convention centre on the other side of the Urumea, the river that runs through the centre of the city. He called Fitznorman, who told him to wait at the main entrance. 5 minutes later, Scott appeared, a little different to Simo's mind. Perhaps it was the well-cut suit he wore, with a scarlet silk tie and a matching shirt, dressed as a well-known art dealer should be. Fitznorman spotted Simmons. It wasn't too difficult. With his Panama and bright shirt, he looked more like a Central American than an Englishman, and the briefcase carried tightly under one arm confirmed his impression. "Nice to see you again, Barry," he said with a broad smile, as though they were old friends. "How was the journey?" "Fine." "No problem with the hotel?" "No, none." "Excellent. Perhaps we should find a quiet spot to talk. Inside?" "I'd prefer not to," Simo replied with a furtive glance at what he supposed were the Congressists, entering and leaving the Kursaal. "Too many art dealers," he said with a weak smile, knowingly tapping the briefcase with a nicotine-stained finger. "I understand. Let's walk across the bridge to the Partie Vieja. There's a small bar I know. It should be quiet at this time of the day." They headed across the bridge, retracing Simo's steps, as he spoke of his business in Belize and Panama, without alluding to the manuscript. Fitznorman guided him past the fine food market, its neoclassical facade and elaborate cornice built in cream-coloured sandstone, which was common to many of the city's buildings, then turning into the Partie Vieja. The crowd was rather sparse, and after a couple of minutes he led Simmons into a narrow bar. The lighting was low, and the bar stretched deep into the shadows. On one side was a series of booths, set against the wall, facing the bar. There the tables were separated by shoulder-height partitions. Fitznorman pointed to the top of the bar, which was loaded with a spectacular display of tapas, set out on trays, and invited his guests to select a few, which they carried to a booth with a couple of glasses of deep red Rioja wine. "It's quiet here, mostly local people during the day. They're a bit wary of mixing together at the moment. You know, the COVID. It's perfect. So, Barry, how can I help you?" Fitznorman asked, thinking of pre-Columbian antiquities, and certain Simmons was not wasting his time after having travelled so far. Simo placed his briefcase on the table and opened it so that the flap hid its contents from the open side of the booth. "I'd like to know what you think of this," he said, carefully moving the glasses and the plates well to one side, then placing the manuscript on one of the paper napkins he'd spread out on the table. Fitznorman opened the cover with great care and proceeded to turn the pages very slowly. "Well, it's not an incunaba," he said softly. Simo frowned. "That means printed before the start of the 16th century, which doesn't mean it's not valuable," he continued as though he was talking to himself. "Neither is it post-incunable. That is printed after 1500 and before 1520 or 1540. Fitznorman was suddenly aware he was talking in riddles. "I'm sorry, Barry. It's quite extraordinary. A codex," he said. "To be precise, a manuscript written by hand before the introduction of the printing press." "A codex?" "Correct. A wonderful work, priceless. Can you tell me something more about it? Where it came from?" Simo told him it had been handed down over generations, from father to son, by an old Belize family. It had come into his hands before the last remaining member of the family passed away, in gratitude for the help he had provided for the old man. There was little else to add, apart from his own very brief internet search. "Yes, the Florentine Codex, that's it, the same thing," announced Fitznorman. "If I remember rightly, there are 3 original books, all in the Laurentian Library in Florence." "That's right, the Biblioteca Medicia Laurentiana," murmured Simo knowledgeably. "The work of Friar Bernardino, the general history of New Spain." "Yes, I visited the museum's internet site and was redirected to the World Digital Library, where a scanned copy was available, all 3,000 pages. I could only look at a few of them, but it's true the resemblance is remarkable." Fitznorman confirmed the general history had been executed in black ink and coloured paints on folios of paper measuring 20 by 28 centimetres, paper that had been made and imported to Mexico from Europe. According to specialists, the text and images had certainly been carried out under the supervision of Bernardino by a number of different writers and artists. In addition, some believed the work had been hastily completed in 1580, probably so as not to miss the Flota de Indias, the annual convoy that carried goods and treasure from the New World across the Atlantic to Spain. "What's it worth?" asked Simo, not wanting to beat about the bush. "Worth? That's a tough question, Barry. Assuming it's genuine, from the time of Bernardino, it's priceless, but from a strictly financial point of view, I'd say it's worth millions." Simo's pulse quickened. "Just to give you an idea, in 1994, Bill Gates bid $33 million for a 72-page manuscript at a Christie's sale in New York, the Codex Chapter. At the time, it was one of the highest prices ever paid for a book. Today, that would be worth more than double that price. Simo emptied his glass of wine in one gulp. Of course, the Codex Chapter was written by Leonardo da Vinci in the early 1500s, but in this case, he said, laying his hand almost reverently on the manuscript, with so few works dating from the early period of the Conquista, it makes this a very unique historical document. Simo tried to say something, but he'd lost his voice. So what's your plan, Barry? I suppose a more detailed examination would be the next logical step, he croaked. Authentication. Yes, dating, identification and description, that is, of the contents. Of course, Simo concurred. But I have to insist, as I mentioned when I called you, this is totally confidential. You can imagine the claims that could be made by the Mexican or even the Spanish governments. Of course. So how can I help? Asked Fitznorman, batting the ball back into Simo's court. Can we find an expert? As a matter of fact, we can, right here in San Sebastian. A good friend of Sir Patrick's, by the way. She's an historian. She? Yes, Anna Bazurko. Simo's face lit up. Yes, I remember her, he said. How could he forget the attractive archaeologist? She was with Sir Patrick in Belize. Scott Fitznorman called his assistant at the Kursaal to announce he would not be back, and cancelled his evening appointment, called a taxi and accompanied Simo back to the Hotel de Londres. It wasn't worth taking the least risk with Simo and his precious charge, especially as he was very visible, a tourist wearing his Panama and a flowered shirt.